Hello and welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. My name is John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET community team. Today I'm joined by Chris, Miha, and Sam to talk about the YARP 1.1 release. So welcome, folks.
Hi.
So before we dig into the community links, can you just introduce yourselves real quick, say what you do?
Chris?
Let's go clockwise. So Chris, that's you next for me.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a developer on ASP.NET and on YARP. I deal a lot with the servers and the protocols and just making things that are quick and efficient. Miha? Oh, sorry, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a program manager, or is it now product manager on .NET Runtime. Working on YARP, Core WCF, various other features. Yeah.
Hey, I'm dev on the runtime side as well, on the networking team, so everything URI, HTTP client, and so on, and also work on YARP.
Awesome. All right, well, we've got some cool stuff to go over with the YARP 1.1 release. First, before we do that, I want to switch over and go through the community links for this week. So the link for this is in the show notes below. We don't have a whole bunch this week, so we'll go relatively quickly. So the first one, Bipin Joshi is going through a master details with Blazor server. So this is the beginning of a 3-part series on that. What's interesting, he's done this in the past using MVC, and MVC is interesting. And I had a thing previously where a former manager was like, hey, how do I do master details with MVC? I was like, well, it's kind of complicated because you have these, the models and mapping and all that. So Blazor is kind of in some ways, a much easier fit for that. So anyways, I'm excited to see what he does with that. So he goes through, talks about his UI setup for how that's going to work. And then he's actually using the Northwind database for that. So he just shows configuring the Northwind database and creating the DB context and the model classes for that. And then off in the next, that's basically the kind of setup for it. And then cliffhanger, we go on to the next one where we'll learn about actually building out the Blazor implementation. So, always cool to see these kind of, taking things and just building it to the next level, and always good to see Northwind making a reappearance. So Damian Bowden continues on his series. He's been going through and showing all these different implementations of kind of more advanced real-world identity integration scenarios. So this one, he's working with OpenIDICT and Keycloak Federation. I actually didn't know about Keycloak, so I went through and read about that. That's an interesting. It's open source. It's supported by Red Hat, and it is an identity kind of backend that provides all these different services. OpenID Connect and SAML and Kerberos, and Federation has an admin console and all this stuff. Looks pretty neat. Never heard of it before, so that's a neat thing to know about. And then what Damian shows is just implementing that, going through and wiring these together. So using OpenIDICT with ASP.NET Core Identity as kind of the integration stuff, and then that's talking over to Keycloak. And so he shows the wire up in order to do that, and talks about the configuration as well in Keycloak. So neat to know about that. And then, as always, he's got his source code, link up at the top. So thanks again to Damian. We'll have to. Been thinking we'll have to have him on the show sometime and just talk through all this, because we featured his stuff pretty regularly. A few other neat things. Sam talking about an interesting idea of exposing gRPC and OData in ASP.NET Core. So just kind of like why not both sort of thing. And he had some repositories, and he said, could I expose those as both an OData endpoint and a gRPC service? And so walking through how actually to do that. And for both of these, just kind of attaching them. And then he kind of compares, querying and connecting to those services from a few different things. So anyways, pretty neat stuff. All right, so this is pretty cool. This is Core WCF 1.0 release, and so this is pretty cool. This has been going in development for a few years, and Sam, feel free to jump in if you've got more to say on here. But so this is the an implementation of WCF for .NET Core with some specific, it does some key specific scenarios to allow for migrating existing WCF clients or servers to .NET 5 or 6. So community projects.
It's not just .NET 5 or 6. So what's interesting here is it is a re-implementation of WCF using ASP.NET Core 2.1 as the basis for it. So it actually works on .NET Framework and .NET Core 3.1 because it's .NET 2, Standard 2 compliant. So what this means is if you have a large application using WCF that you want to modernize to Core, you can either go directly to Core, or what you can actually do is update to Core WCF first while you're still on .NET Framework, and then bring it through the migration wizard to Core, and it's going to be really easy at that point. So it gives you more flexibility there. It's not a complete WCF implementation, but it covers the major points. And it's a community project. It was kind of not something we wanted to ship in the box as part of .NET. And so it was created as a community project. It's contributed to by a ton of other people. Some great folks from Amazon and AWS are actually some of the most prolific contributors and working on features for it. And so it's great to see.
Very cool. All right. So now we get to some of the, some of the core things. So this is the YARP GitHub page. I'm just including in a link here. Somebody already asking in the comments what the YARP, and so it's yet another reverse proxy, and we'll be digging way into that a bit. But so it says here, a toolkit for developing high-performance HTTP reverse proxy applications. And then this is the release post. This is what prompted me to ping all you folks and say, let's get on the show and let's talk through what's new. So this is a release post. Some of the cool new features are listed here. you want it to just, should I turn it over to you folks to talk through it, or do you want to talk through with the blog post up here, or what sounds good?
I can talk through, considering I wrote the blog post, I can talk through the high-level details, and then Chris and Miha can fill in the actual details. So 1.1 is an incremental release. We released YARP 1.0 in sync with .NET 6 last November. This is kind of incremental release of features that we wanted to do that we didn't get time to do in the 1.0 release, and also based on feedback. So going through the list, 0-byte reads. This is a major performance improvement when you're proxying WebSocket connections. So typically with WebSocket, they'll send some data and then be idle for a long time. And what we were doing was allocating buffers for each of those WebSockets, but that basically causes memory pressure. So using 0-byte reads, we can basically have a read that's saying like, hey, is there any data? Come back when there's some data. And then we allocate the buffer. So it means the scalability for WebSockets has shot up massively.
You know what? I'm sorry. I realized we went through, because I've been reading about YARP and I read through it, but I think there are people that like have no idea even. Can we talk just a little bit more, like what is a reverse proxy? Why would you use it? What are the kind of use cases?
A reverse proxy is typically used as a gateway between the internet and a data center and a set of web services in the data center. There's other scenarios where you can use them within the data center for kind of mesh scenarios, but it allows you to remap requests that come in to different servers. So you can have kind of a mapping in the URL space, and it allows you to do load balancing across multiple backend servers, change protocols, because the proxy actually terminates the HTTP connection and establishes a new connection to the destination. So there's a lot of things that you can do with a reverse proxy, particularly if you don't want to change the backend service. You can use the reverse proxy to support HTTP2 on a server that isn't capable of it, or add authentication in front of a service. Lots of scenarios like that. Typically, reverse proxy is applied as an exe with big configuration files you have to figure out how to handle. But in talking with a bunch of internal services, they needed things that were just that bit too far off the beaten path to be available in a typical proxy. And to extend those is a lot of work. And so what we've designed with YARP is a library and some templates for how to construct your own proxy with that, but that you can then customize by adding your own modules into it, replacing parts of YARP or supplementing them as needed.
What I find really like appealing to me about this is, like, number one, you can write that code in .NET as opposed to having to like go into like C++ or some other language. So I can keep using .NET logic. I can use like NuGet packages or whatever. And then also it's implemented as ASP.NET Core middleware, right?
Yes.
So I can, like, if I'm an ASP.NET dev, like, instead of like going and configuring a proxy service using a bunch of YAML or using something, you know what I mean? Like I can just write code, I can debug, and I can have pretty dynamic logic and stuff.
If you are familiar with .NET, then it should be very easy to get started with YARP. And out of the box, it does most of the common proxy scenarios, just configurable with config, but you can customize that. Common things we've heard of are people adding authentication, pulling the route information from some of the source rather than from configuration. So one of the big services that's using it now is Azure App Service. And so in many cases, if you're using App Service, you'll be routed through YARP right now. But they have hundreds of thousands of servers at the back end, and they're using YARP to figure out which one is running your site, and if one isn't running your site yet, to spin one up and then redirect the requests over to it. And so that's not something you can put in a config file. So that's all dynamic and done through YARP.
Okay. Sounds good. Cool. So, and you know, please, as we have questions coming in, if people have questions in the chat or whatever, feel free to ask. And then let me see. Cool. So going back to the blog post, and talking about that with that in context, having 0 byte reads, that's an example as you're talking about. Like, on the one hand, it's great to be able to write configurable C# code and all that, but performance is super important. So then the idea here is being able to just say, is there data to be read before you allocate anything to read that data, right?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. All right. So next up, we've got multi-value header matching.
Miha, I think you implemented this one, didn't you?
Yeah, so previously we had a bit of a cliff. You could specify in config when you wanted your routes to match by giving us like a header name and a value you wanted us to match, and we have different options to specify whether you just care about whether the header exists or it has a specific value or just contains some value and so on. But there was this drop-off where if there was more than one value or the header was added multiple times, would just give up completely on matching that. And if you cared about that scenario, you would then have to go write your own middleware or your own routing implementation just to be able to handle that scenario. So in 1.1, we added support for multiple headers. We'll handle them correctly, split them correctly, remove quotes, etc., etc. Essentially giving you the option to implement all these scenarios still in config.
Okay, cool. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, so let's just take some of those live and we can get to those as we go, and then we can jump back into some of the features. So here, let me switch this up and let's go. Let me see. What are the difference between YARP and Nginx?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Sam hinted at this earlier. Nginx is a pre-built application that has a giant config file to set how you want to route all the traffic, match the requests, send them over there, all that fun stuff. While YARP can basically be used in that mode, YARP is much better when you actually want to get in there and customize anything, because there's only so much you can express in a config file. So YARP lets you actually write C# code to examine requests, customize the requests, choose where they need to go, and all that fun stuff. While Nginx does have some extensibility, it's pretty limited, and you have to do it in either Lua or you have to recompile Nginx in C++, which isn't fun for anybody.
Okay. So that kind of thing where you need to customize it, and then like if you want to be able to write customizable, if you actually want to write code, this is like a pretty good fit for that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Sounds good. All right. Well, here again, compared to Nginx, it's like going to be common. But how about the scale? And we had another question too, as far as like, do you have like some sort of kind of performance numbers, or what should we talk about as far as like scale and performance?
If you go to, if you open your browser to aka.ms/ASP.NET Core/benchmarks, I believe.
All right. aka.ms. You said
ASP.NET Core
benchmarks?
/benchmarks. Is that right, Chris?
I think it might be without the core. It's just ASP.NET/benchmarks.
All right. Let's see.
ASP.NET, sorry.
All right. I'm in an unauthenticated, I'm in a guest session in my browser. So there we go. Coming on up.
So this is an amazing Power BI site by Sebastian, one of our performance devs. And at the bottom of the page, can you hide the question?
Yeah.
At the very bottom of the page, it says 1 of 21 because there's 21 different tabs. If you click on the 1 of 21 rather than trying to go through it, and then scroll down, you'll see proxies. It's like 2 more down from where you are. So this is tests that get run every night, comparing YARP with other proxies. So for like checking our latest bits, but you can choose, you can control select to choose different proxies, payload sizes, which protocols, so is that HTTP, HTTP2, and then I think that's the main stuff. Payload sizes. You probably also want to swing the date time piece just to like the last month or so, because otherwise you're looking at how the perf is compared over the past 2 years.
Yeah.
So that is YARP versus Envoy with a very large payload. If you go into a smaller payload like 1K or 10K. And so all of these benchmarks are run on a hardware configuration known as Citrine, which is what we put together for the Tech Empower benchmarks. So it's some serious hardware. And depending on the particular scenario, often we'll find it's actually pegging out the network rather than CPU and other things that are the limitation. And that's a 40 gig network.
Okay. Very cool. All right, let's go back into some questions here. And I'll get that link. I'll share that link in the comments in a second here. All right, questions. Let's see my starred ones. We're just talking about the multi-header routing. It says breaking change. How exactly is it breaking?
There's a few differences in it. So we'll now match against more headers than we would have previously. So if you were expecting a given value to match or not match before, we might break that expectation. So you might have to adjust your matching rules to account for that. If you explicitly specify like a value as multiple values, so you already specified foo, comma, bar as the thing you want to match against, we no longer do that since we will match only against each specific value. We'll split it for you. So if that's the case, there are some you can specify multiple rules instead of just one for multiple values and so on. So there's some subtleties in edge cases where we now will match or won't match that you can still write rules for. We'll still support it. It might just change your expectations. So we want to call it out so you're not too surprised.
Okay. Question on IP ranges, like dynamic IP restriction. Is it, so I mean, you have access, so you can write rules about IP. Can you do ranges?
So anything you can do with ASP.NET, you can do with YARP.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think that's going to be a common thing because people, then there's another question on like, can we do extensions and that sort of stuff? And I mean, I would think the main extension, like you can write code. Is there like is there a possibility to like plug in stuff? Is there like a plug-in model?
Yeah, so just as ASP.NET has middleware, in YARP we have a pipeline, which is actually implemented as ASP.NET middleware. So you can stick ASP.NET middleware before us. Then in our pipeline, you can add your own custom modules in there. So we go through different stages. We match to a routing cluster. We then go through load balancing, health checks, load balancing, sessions are in there as well. So you can add your own as needed.
Okay.
So one of the questions I think I saw was like, do we have session stickiness for Blazor? Yes. That's one of the options.
Very cool.
Another question is, what was the difference between YARP and Ocelot?
Yeah.
Ocelot is an application gateway. So it is one of the design decisions we made with YARP is we are kind of transparent when it comes to the body of the request and response. We don't want to do transforms of the actual body. Once you start buffering and doing things there, your performance changes dramatically. And so that was one of the kind of core design decisions. Whereas with Ocelot, you can, for instance, have a request come in and then go off to 3 different servers, and then it'll aggregate the results together. You could implement that on top of YARP if you want, but it's not kind of part of the core functionality we supply.
Okay. All right. Wow, a lot of questions coming in. This is great. Question on Kubernetes ingress. Several questions on Kubernetes.
Kubernetes is something that a community member, David Bevan from Australia, is working on for us. It's not, none of the 3 of us are particular experts in Kubernetes, and it's one of those deep, dark texts that you need an expert working on. So there's a bunch of community members who are working on that, and we're hoping that will be part of a 2.0 release. Cool.
All right. Lots of questions. This is great. Question. So you just mentioned Kubernetes. Another one on Let's Encrypt support. And they're like, Let's Encrypt would be great. And I noticed from going through your docs today that there's a walkthrough here using the Let's Encrypt thing. And it's like just like a few lines of code, right?
Yeah, so this is actually a really good example of the kind of extensibility you can do in YARP based on ASP.NET. So to add Let's Encrypt to YARP is basically adding Let's Encrypt to ASP.NET. And then I don't believe there's really any more in there that was actually truly YARP specific.
This is pretty cool. And so like this, like, and the walkthrough, like you can literally, I did the getting started in like 5 minutes this morning. Like it's super quick. But basically you add the YARP package and then your configuration, like you configure the middleware, the kind of standard, middleware configuration stuff. And then this app settings is just where you define these rules. So, and then that's basically like, those are the steps I saw so far. So that's pretty
cool. So it's pretty much the same as you would do for Let's Encrypt for ASP.NET, but using YARP for its routes and clusters as kind of middleware beyond that.
Okay. So a question on how this would apply like as an API gateway in a microservice. So, I mean, I feel this is just kind of like, there's the similar thing, right? Anything you can write, this is a proxy and you could create an API gateway using your custom ASP.NET code and just farm it out to your different endpoints, right?
So it depends on what you want to do in your API gateway. Typically, it'll get down to semantics of what is the difference between an API gateway and a reverse proxy. And kind of Ocelot, I think, was a good example of that, where it's actually doing more than just proxying requests to a destination. It is taking action based on the content of the request to decide where to route it. In YARP, we kind of limit that to the header part, the request header, rather than cracking open the body, because we'll just stream the body to whichever destination we've actually finally selected.
Okay. All right. We've got more questions coming in, but I do want to get through the features, and we may answer some of these questions as we go. So I'll switch back over to the release post, and we can keep going through that. So here we go. Okay. So we had multi-header. I believe we're up to HTTP 3 support.
So ASP.NET support, .NET 6 supports HTTP 3. It's a feature we're continuing to work on. In .NET 6, it's classified as a preview feature because it's not had the testing to be kind of as rock solid as we would want it to be. But if you enable that, and then YARP will automatically use HTTP 3. There's not much more to it than that. Talking with customers, some internal people have been doing performance analysis on HTTP 3, and what is really showing is it's great as a last mile protocol. So between kind of your data center and customer devices, but within the data center itself, it's a lot less useful. So it's kind of one of those interesting places where reverse proxy, having that on the edge of your data center, sorry, the cat's tail is in the way. You can have HTTP3 going between your mobile clients, where they may not necessarily have a particularly stable network connection, to the proxy server, and then it can talk HTTP2 over the low latency connection to your server. If something's a kind of less than a millisecond, performance analysis showing that HTTP2 is still a lot faster than HTTP3 in those scenarios. Mostly because the networking gear hasn't actually caught up to having as great UDP support as it does for TCP.
Okay.
So it's kind of underlying infrastructure is where things are bottlenecked there.
So this gives you the option to like expose one front end to your clients, and then internally in your data center, you can optimize for whatever the highest performance or whatever. Yeah. Cool. All right. So multi-config sources. So from my reading of the docs, I kept seeing like the app settings JSON. What sort of other config sources is this the standard ASP.NET mindset where like the config providers, I can use any config provider sort of idea?
Oh, I'll take that one. So yes, there's the config story. You can pull it from environment variables or app settings JSON or anything like that. That's for the basic standard. Here's the URLs, here's the matching, here's the destinations. The other thing that is key for YARP is that the source you're pulling data from is the main point of extensibility. And so the Kubernetes folks have completely replaced that. They're not going through the iConfiguration or app settings JSON. They're pulling, they've implemented a service in YARP that is pulling directly from Kubernetes and funneling that data into the YARP config. And we have similar implementations for Service Fabric, for example.
Okay.
And that data can be live reloaded and react to all the changes in your environment. You just tell us when it's ready.
All right, cool. I just let me see. I was just seeing this is fun watching in the chat. So Anton is asking a question about memory consumption data on the charts, and Sebastian says, "Great, just added to the charts. Cache should be updated tomorrow." So that's neat to see. All right, so cool. HTTP.sys delegation. So that sounds interesting. So the HTTP.sys, that's low-level networking stack implemented on Windows only, right? So if I'm running on Windows, then to be able to use that can, and I'm totally going to be wrong on this, but you don't have to do the transitions between like user and whatever mode. Does that have something to do? I don't know. You guys talk.
You're getting pretty close there.
Okay.
So you're right. HTTP.sys is a Windows-only HTTP server. It runs in kernel mode, and it has some interesting features like being able to port share across processes. This delegation feature is new because what it does is it lets you look at a request that you've received, choose to delegate it to another process on the same machine without proxying the request. You're just saying, here, send it to process 45. Technically, you're saying, put it in queue number 4, and somebody else will pick it up. This is really efficient because you don't have to reserialize the request. You don't have to copy the body or any of that stuff. You're just doing a handoff to the side to another process. Has some trade-offs, like you can't modify the headers like you would in a normal proxy, and you can't see the response. But that is a reasonable trade-off for the performance benefits of that approach.
I'm curious, like, how does that actually work? Is there like an API for HTTP.sys where you can say, here's a thing, deal with it?
Yep.
Okay.
It's literally take this request ID, put it into other queue.
Okay.
So it allows you to use YARP for routing either to destinations through YARP itself, or if there is an appropriate destination already plugged into that instead of HTTP.sys, then to delegate to that instead.
Right. And you can mix and match these. You can say this destination is on the same machine hosted by HTTP.sys, transfer to that guy. But these other destinations are off box, or they're using some other server, proxy to them.
Okay. And this feels like, so I don't know what all supports HTTP/sys, but it seems like if you've got other, even like say legacy web apps or something running on, then you could like have a very high performance hybrid application as you're doing it.
And it should be said that IIS is also built on HTTP/sys, so you can delegate to IIS.
Wow. Okay. I'm guessing with some of this, there's some pretty interesting, like, because some of this came from things where you were working with internal teams at Microsoft that were needing this sort of functionality, right? So I'm sure you run into some interesting use cases at Microsoft where they've got existing like services and stuff they need to work with.
And this was literally built by an internal partner for us.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty cool. All right. APIs from Middleware. I got to confess, this is one of the most interesting ones that I've like wanted to talk. And you've kind of hinted at some of this before. But what's the story? Is there more if we click through on this? Is there, like A/B testing for one. So how does that here? I guess I'll go through that. I'm just randomly clicking stuff.
Sam, did you want to take this one?
I can have a go. So typically with YARP, you have a configuration that points at a series of routes and clusters. Routes are the rules for how to match things, and then a cluster is basically a collection of destination servers. Once YARP has picked a route, it kind of used to be pretty fixed and you couldn't do much with it. It's going to pull the cluster that's pointed at by the route and you're kind of done, and that's what route YARP will choose. When you're doing something like A/B testing, you may want to actually have two different clusters, one for A and one for B. What this allows you to do is intercept that point and say, based on this extensibility, you can add your own kind of key value pairs to the route and the cluster. So based on whatever settings you want there or anywhere else that you can pull code from, you can actually then tell YARP, it was supposed to go to cluster A, but instead I want you to go to cluster B instead. So this allows you to kind of enumerate the routes and clusters live at that particular, or a snapshot at that particular point in the request, and then redirect as you want to. So it provides kind of an extra capability in the middleware to do stuff within the YARP pipeline that wasn't otherwise possible before.
Okay. So this starts to get into, like, as I'm writing things that are going to rely on an API, I'm going to want to understand, like, I want to query, like, I want to find out which of my endpoints is least busy right now, or, you know what I mean? Sort of like interact with the different things that I'm proxying to. How far does the API go now, and where are you thinking about it kind of future-wise? Is that a big enough question?
So some of that gets into health checks, which I'll have Miha talk about in a minute. But we have two kind of forms of health checking in YARP. One is active, whereby you define for each destination a URL that we will go ping and kind of time out information for how often to ping it. And we will make a request to that URL and look at the response code. And if it's 200, then we'll keep it. If it's not, we'll temporarily take it out of the list. We also then have passive health checks that is looking at the response code for each request proxy to a particular destination. And if those keep coming back with errors, then similarly that destination will be temporarily removed, and there's kind of back off periods and other pieces there. But you can, through the providers for those, listen and do your own logic if you want. Okay. Miha, did I get anything wrong there?
No, that was a pretty good description. And I think part of that question hinted at load balancing as well with least busy destination. So we do out of the box provide you different modes that you can use for load balancing. You can choose just proxy to do whatever the first destination is on the list. You can choose random, or you can do the least loaded one, or in our terms, that means whichever destination is currently processing the fewest request. But of course, this is all configurable in code. So if you want to react to something else, you have your own telemetry, your own data you want to use to make this load balancing decisions. You can. It's just a matter of implementing an interface.
Yeah, and the default algorithm we chose is an interesting one, which is the least loaded of two random choices. It turns out that random is not particularly good at choosing things correctly.
Depends if you're lucky.
Yeah, and there are mathematical white papers on load balancing algorithms. There's some really interesting research done into it. So
Random is surprisingly not that terrible, though.
yeah, round robin is actually one of the worst.
Huh. Okay. Because you're guaranteed eventually to hit the worst one. So I actually clicked around like I do, and I found too in the docs there. So here's the API documentation, and it's got this. Is this? I think I'm looking in the right place here, like proxy state lookup and that sort of thing. This is where.
Yeah. So these were the APIs that we were talking about for getting the state of YARP in terms of here's the list of routes, here's the list of clusters. You can also do the try get cluster, try get route, which is like find one with a specific name. If you can, those are faster because it means it doesn't have to enumerate them all. This kind of snapshot functionality here. So as YARP is running, whenever you make a configuration change, all the requests that are in progress right now, currently in progress, will have a snapshot of the configuration that was used when they were started, and then subsequent new requests will take on that new configuration. So it's managing that is one of the important kind of parts of a reverse proxy, so things don't change from under you mid-flight in a request.
Okay. And that's an interesting feature of YARP that wasn't totally obvious, is that it'll pick up changes to config as you go, right? So it watches that, and so without restarting the app, I can make changes, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, so if you're using config files, you can just go make changes to the config file, or if you're doing custom config, which is basically the config provider, you give us the list of routes and clusters, and then also a semaphore message that you flag when you want changes. There are changes, and it'll go reread that data from you.
Okay. Let me see. So as I started looking at this, the next thing I wanted, my small brain was I wanted like a dashboard, right? Because I can see you've got an API for this. Is there any thought on building some sort of dashboard for, surfacing this information?
I think I said like there's a couple of issues in the 100 range that I think 151. I don't know why that's stuck in my memory. For providing that kind of API stuff, we just haven't got around to it yet.
Okay.
If someone wants to contribute it, we'd be glad to look at the PR.
The one thing I'll say about dashboards is that people tend to want them to look a certain way, or like blend in with your application, or have authentication on them, all those things. And so what we're likely to provide first is the data for you to make your own dashboard. Mm-hmm. And some of these APIs, like these cluster APIs right here, are good to that end.
That makes sense. Yeah. You expose the data, and then I can show the data however I want to. What another thing I was thinking with this is, like, these are APIs in code. Are there common like management APIs that you know what I mean, that you would expose, where you could via REST or something, I could say change my thing? I mean, I get, like, I've got the APIs here, I could do that myself, right? But can I programmatically?
Not
is there
yet.
a good pattern? What's that?
Not yet.
Okay.
It's one of the features that we're talking about is having an endpoint that you can that servers can basically talk to say like, hey, register me, remove me. There's a kind of bunch of migration internal apps that are migrating from IIS to ASP.NET that want to do incremental upgrades at parts of the site. And so that and HTTP.sys delegation is why kind of is functionality we're looking at in that area.
Okay, cool. One thing while we're looking at the docs, I mean, the docs are, especially for a relatively small team, you guys have pretty good docs. And somebody's asking in the comments here, you know, how are you doing that? And so I saw here, this is docfx you're using to generate these, right? So
this is literally docfx, and this is just generating. I would say our reference docs are not as good as they could be because it's just based off the code comments, the XML comments in the code. Docfx is great. You point it at the assembly, and it will go generate great-looking docs with very little work.
I think if I click through it, it's one of your workflow, or docfx build. So I'm like totally into GitHub Actions, by the way, lately. I'm just every time I'm always reading, oh, okay, all right, I want to use a matrix here. Okay, that's nice. So, anyways,
yeah, actually, I mean, even docs.microsoft.com is actually built from docfx stuff.
Cool. Well, and that was the last thing on the list. And there was documentation. So we've got. We talked about Let's Encrypt. We didn't talk about configuration filters and WebSocket. You want to go through?
Chris kind of talked about the support for multiple configuration providers, and that's where config filters is another feature in there, where as you're loading the config, you can make changes to that. One good example for that is if you have a configuration file, but you don't know you want to pull a URL from environment variable or something. Adding a config filter allows you to like parse those parameters as they come through and inline replace them. I believe I wrote a sample for that. Sorry.
Okay. So it's funny. Sakib has a question here that I was thinking myself, because these source generators are always on my mind. Is there an opportunity to use source generators, for instance, to skip parsing config? So I get that you're reacting to configuration changes live as the application runs, but it does seem interesting if you could like at build, you could, you know, parse through things. Is there a thought on using source generators for some of that?
I would probably lean against that from the perspective of if you use source generators, that means you need to rebuild the proxy, rebuild the code for it. The advantage of config is you can create a container or whatever with YARP and just update the configuration file, and you can do that while YARP is actually running and requests are in flight. Then it's like as soon as the config has been processed, there's a kind of instantaneous flip over, and then new request will use that new configuration. So it's much more dynamic to do it the way that we've done, and I don't think there's actually that much benefit to embedding that in code because it's really just state information.
What is there a pattern for? And I'm thinking maybe with some of your teams that you've worked with. Sometimes these kind of reroute or routing rules can get huge, right? I mean, like I wouldn't be surprised if you're saying like, megabytes of JSON to parse through or things like that. Is that how do you handle things where your configuration starts to get complex?
So those scenarios typically don't use configuration. They use, depending on the size, they will either use the config providers, so they can just supply the data directly into YARP, or the larger scenarios, the core engine of YARP that will actually proxy requests is the HTTP forwarder. And so you can just use that component together with your own ASP.NET endpoint and write whatever logic you want to determine where to route the request, and then call the forwarder, and it will do that work of forwarding the request. And so for the really high scale scenarios, that's the way that they're typically doing it. Chris, you're giving me weird looks.
No, I was just liking the last comment in the stream. Somebody got a .NET Yahtzee.
Oh,
I try and make it part of every ASP.NET stand-up now. I got to bring in source generators somehow, and fortunately the commenters make that relatively easy too. So, this is a good question from Chad. What would be the best Azure service to host YARP? Like, would you go with a standard like a web app, or would you want to do like?
It would mainly make sense as something that you're hosting on the edge. Like if you're hosting an app service, they're running YARP for you. And so they have all that front-end infrastructure that you don't really need to deal with. If you're running in containers or you're running in a VM or somewhere like that where you're hosting your own infrastructure, it makes a little more sense.
Okay.
I guess the answer is, when would you actually need this functionality?
Yeah, because yeah. I guess I could. So, would it be useful if you're so you can proxy anywhere on the internet, right? You don't have to proxy within the data center. So you could potentially, I've got a really disorganized whatever. I've got multiple endpoints I could be pointing people to, and
yeah, there's no limit on where you can proxy to. So if you're migrating services from on-prem to a cloud provider, potentially pointing the clients directly at a proxy means that you can then redirect, or redirect is the wrong term. You can proxy the calls to the appropriate destination depending on where it's actually hosted.
Okay. Question here on like disk-based caching, as in with Varnish.
Sebastian is working on a whole new ASP.NET middleware for response caching that I believe is going to support, or he aspires to support disk-based caches there.
Okay.
I can get you the link from ASP.NET for that. And that should just work with YARP.
So then that's another interesting thing, right? Being able to work with other middleware, I can just pull that in. That is pretty slick. There's a question here on Unix domain socket backend.
So I put in a link to a sample for that.
Okay.
Also written by Sebastian.
Okay. Let me see. Try and find it. Is that the TLS termination? No. Okay. It's in the comments or something. Sorry, I didn't see it.
Oh, yeah, it's in the main comments feed.
Cool. There's a question on authentication. So, like, just general authentication in general. How do you manage like redirects? How do you, and then like, can we talk more about authentication, JOT tokens, and all that kind of stuff?
Chris, you're going to take that one.
Sure. Since we're proxying HTTP at a pretty basic level, most of that's transparent to YARP. For OpenID Connect, and you're doing a 301 redirect loop, YARP just proxies back the 301 to the client, and the client goes off to the identity server, and it comes back with a token and gets proxied back through again. YARP didn't have to do anything special. And things like JOT tokens are even more transparent. They're just a header that gets forwarded through. It doesn't get interesting until you try to do something like Windows, NTLM, negotiate Kerberos, at which point I'm just going to tell you to stop. Those don't proxy. Do not proxy any of those, please.
All right. Let me see. What about rate limiting?
What about it?
I don't know. Is it possible to, like, say I needed to implement rate limiting? How would I do that? Could I do that with YARP, or is that the wrong place to be looking?
It's not a bad place. There's a whole set of features coming in .NET 7 for ASP.NET and .NET runtime rate limiting that will be pretty easy to integrate into YARP.
Okay, cool. And then auto discovery of containers.
So that's once you get into kind of container systems, that's where the integration with Kubernetes and Service Fabric come into play. So essentially, it's kind of really smart configuration providers that talk to not instrumentation, orchestration of those container systems, and can then pull in destination stuff. There's the internal team that's been working on Service Fabric, and I believe they have a GitHub for that. And then, as I said, we've got some external contributors who are leading up Kubernetes integration support.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've gone through the features that were called out in the blog post. One of there was WebSocket support. I guess their documentation on WebSocket support. Anything to talk about there, or is it just?
It just works.
Okay. Cool.
Well, that's all the doc says.
Okay. Nice. Okay, well, so that's what's in 1.1. Can we talk about what's next? What are your thoughts on the next YARP?
The Kubernetes support is going to be a very big feature. Other ideas that are knocking around. There's a discussion thread about placing a YARP on on-premise data center where you can't reach it externally because of the firewall, and so effectively using an instance of YARP on site there and an instance, let's say, in the cloud, and creating a tunnel between them, and then being able to proxy requests through that tunnel to servers on-prem, kind of transparently to those servers. So that's one feature.
That starts to get, that's related or feels related to like the BFF pattern, the back end for front end. Is there, or?
It's one of the features of like Azure. I've forgotten the team name in Azure.
Azure Stack Edge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Has a connecting tunnel between your Azure on-prem and your Azure in the cloud, doing something like this.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But that tunnel has to be established from the on-prem side because of the firewalls. But then you want to make requests from the cloud side.
Oh.
So the connection management is backwards from normal, and you need to handle that at a pretty low layer in the stack.
And I believe for that one today, you actually have to make specific calls from the server that you're going to use, whereas this would be transparent. Like the idea here is because it's a proxy, the proxy needs to have that intelligence, but the actual servers that you're proxying to don't. As far as they're concerned, it's just a request coming within their network.
Okay. Let me see. Yeah. So Jonathan was asking, is there a ongoing discussion?
Let me look up which issue that is.
Yeah, if you give me the issue number, I can.
And then the ASP.NET architect, David Fowler, he has another feature. We kind of talked briefly, kind of alluding to it. There are large internal teams with very large ASP.NET infrastructure who are wanting to migrate to .NET Core, but they can't do a big bang. They have to do it over a long period. So looking at features for how you can kind of have a YARP proxy as the effectively a mesh router on the same host, with then individual sites as they're moved to .NET Core, hosted as independent instances, and then use that proxy to route to them, but having kind of self-registration that they're available export listening for such a request kind of type. So it's more kind of dynamic configuration by having endpoints that individual services can talk to.
Okay. All right.
I just dropped a link in the chat there for you.
I thought that was it. I wasn't sure that was right. So cool. I just sent it out. Awesome. Okay. Any other kind of future things you're thinking about, or questions we've got for community? We've got some people. It's great too to see people as they're watching and talking about how it's worked well for them. So I mean, just several people have been mentioning like, hey, this has been helping with some of our migration things and that sort of stuff. So
yeah, so we have we're only just starting discussions about what we want to do in 2.0, and we are very community driven. So if you have feature requests and things, or those feature requests are already in the queue, stick a thumbs up on that, stick a heart on it, so we can see, hi babes, what people want.
Okay. Let me see. Your question from Chad on, for monitoring dashboards currently is App Insights, or what's the best way to kind of monitor?
App Insights will just work, right? So YARP being just a library in ASP.NET, we try to make it as easy as possible for you to configure it. So whether you're using App Insights or something else with OpenTelemetry in their SDK, you would essentially have the same configuration with YARP. Just plug in add application insights, and you'll see it light up on both sides. So you can observe the proxy as part of all your other infrastructure. And we made work in .NET 6 to make that even more customizable if you need to.
Okay. I did see too in the docs, there's an article on, oops, they're on there. Like you have information on diagnosing, including integration with logging, which is pretty neat. So like, for instance, ASP.NET 6 request logging, and then telemetry events and that sort of thing. So, and then I get, as far as a dashboard, you'd need to expose that. But so, Jonathan's saying they're using OpenTelemetry with New Relic too. So, cool. Let me see. What about high availability with YARP?
Again, that's the same as ASP.NET. You run multiple instances, and you go from there.
Okay.
Run multiple instances, stick a network load balancer in front of those multiple instances. So that's working at the layer 3, layer 4. It's not looking at the request, and then use YARP as kind of the level layer 7 to actually look at the request and decide where to route it based on the information in there.
This is something I always have to brush off of my. So like layer 3, level 4, those are forwarding more at the network level, and they're
so that's
not inspecting, and
that's the old ISO OSI diagram that doesn't really map very well to TCP, but the layers that we kind of talk about are layer 4, which is at the TCP layer. So what's the destination IP and address? And then layer 7 is kind of HTTP, where you actually look at the request details.
Okay. So that's getting that distinction right. You're going to have higher performance if you do your processing that doesn't require looking at headers, doesn't require that kind of logic. It's if you can do that at the network layer, do it. And then otherwise, where YARP shines is where you're actually like.
Yeah, that's the kind of functionality that's implemented by your data center network, your expensive Cisco switches, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay. Question. So I think, Chris, you had said this earlier. Azure App Services using YARP today in production? Is that?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
It is being rolled out, so it depends exactly on which data center and kind of randomly within there which hosts you're assigned to within there.
But at this point, it's running a majority of traffic through app service.
Yeah.
Wow. So does that then, is there a possibility if it's running on all these different app services, like running an app service, is there a possibility to expose or plug into that at some? Okay. It's just an implementation.
It is the implementation detail of app service. And the only thing that is preventing it from being rolled out 100% is there are some applications that have taken very weird esoteric dependencies on the way IIS and app service was written many years ago and do horrible violations of HTTP protocol, but they still expect to work.
Okay. All right. Well, awesome. Is there anything more you want to cover? Or?
Thanks for such a great series of questions.
All right. I will put the link to the blog. So I shared the roll-up thing that includes all the links. I'm putting the blog post here. And then this includes the GitHub repo. And so people can follow along in there too. Compliments again on the docs. I was pretty happy with just going through the walkthrough, and I did the .NET 6 version, and it's pretty straightforward. So I think this is a great tool to have available.
Well, thanks for having us.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody, and I'll say goodbye then. Bye, folks.